One of the experiences I trust every homebrewer shares is the feeling of awe that comes from witnessing the conversion of wort into beer through the fermentation process. Even after 15 years, I still get giddy when I see the first signs of airlock activity, a nice fluffy kreuzen developing on top of my beer. The worst is when this takes too long. You all know the anxiety that comes from checking on a batch a day after pitching and seeing no action. This is why we love Imperial Yeast, who pack 200 billion cells of the purest yeast into each pitch-right pouch, which assures quick starts, healthy fermentation, and predictably great results. I strongly urge all of our listeners to check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and let them know that you appreciate their support of the Brewlosophy podcast while you're at it. All right, on to the show. Following a beer-laden visit to Bavaria that I took when I was 22 years old with my now wife, I presumed pretty much anything made with wheat would taste like the hazy Weiss beer I inhaled during that trip. It wasn't until I was accidentally served the wrong beer at a Seattle restaurant the following year that I learned otherwise. This is the Brewlosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Shutt, and joining me on this episode to discuss the style known as American wheat beer is contributor Andy Carter.
Yeah, Marshall, just like you have had many of these in the past, thirst quenching, refreshing. I really can't think of a more quintessential summer beer than American wheat ale.
It's so good. I'll never forget the first time I tried Widmer Brothers Hefeweizen. That was the one that was accidentally served to me. I was out on a date with, again, the woman who's now my wife. This was maybe 18 years ago or so. And I'd ordered an IPA because that was all anybody cool drank back then, you know? Well, the server left me this very pale, hazy beer with a lemon wedge on the rim instead. When I called her back, she offered to let me keep the beer as an apology and told me what it was. I fully expected it to taste like the similar looking Hefeweizens I'd had the year prior when I was in Munich, but boy was I wrong. I absolutely love that beer and continue to be a huge fan of American wheat beer today. I look forward to digging into this style with you, Andy, as well as the results of my attempt to brew one using short and shoddy methods. All right, if you like what we're up to and you want us to keep doing it, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy. By committing to a small monthly pledge over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Our guest for this month, December of 2021, is homebrewer gone pro and recent guest on this show, John Luce from Loose Ends Brewing Company out of Dayton, Ohio. John has been a patron of Brewlosophy for the last few years and is very open to answering whatever questions folks might have about everything from his brewing process to his experience turning a hobby into a profession. He'll be sitting down with patrons this Saturday, December 18th, 2021. So make sure to make your pledge of just $3 or more per month by Friday the 17th, which will also give you access to all past sessions with guests like John Palmer, Michael Tonsmeyer, Dr. Tom Shellhammer, John Kimmich from The Alchemist, and many, many more. To check out all of the other rewards you can get for helping us do what we do, head over to patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who have an array of amazing purpose-built stainless brewing products to improve your brew day. If you're looking for a high-quality pilot brewery, make sure to check out the gorgeous BH15 single-tier system, which comes with a hard plumb manifold to eliminate all hosing changes during the brew process. Head over to brewershardware.com to see what they're all about, and make sure to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. Again, that's brewershardware.com. Brewlosophy patron Matt Adams from Wisconsin wrote in with some feedback regarding designing beer recipes. He said, a topic I wonder about is making recipes that don't fit into specific beer style guidelines. I made your Pink Moon Ale, and it was extremely popular. I was thinking about exactly what style it would be. Amber Ale? Maybe, but not exactly. I get stuck picking a style from the guidelines first, then designing a recipe. I like that you do it in reverse. That's something I'm working on changing. I'm designing a beer for next summer, but I'm trying to stay clear of a defined style and just bring characteristics I am searching for. So, Pink Moon Ale is this sort of nondescript beer that I originally designed and brewed, I think it was like 8 or 9 years ago at this point. My whole goal with it was to rely on ingredient flavor descriptors and what I knew about usage rates rather than trying to match a specific style. And yeah, it turned out really well, at least good enough that I ended up brewing it a few times and sharing it with friends who, like Matt's friends, really seemed to enjoy it. I think this idea of brewing in reverse, as Matt seemed to put it, is a lot of fun, though I do still brew to specific styles at times as well.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of the art, science, hobbyistness of brewing is that once you learn enough, you learn the notes like playing music or cooking. Once you learn the notes, then you can go the opposite direction, start playing, and then seeing where you end up, right? And I love the idea of reading the descriptors because, you can't use every malt. No one's going to use every simple type of crystal malt or caramel malt or special B or something like that, right? So you have to rely on those, but then you have to rely on your own sense memory. And when you drink someone's beer, when you know the exact recipe and how they made that, then you can put that in your memory bank and then use that going forward. And if you brew long enough, like Marshall and I've been brewing for more than a decade each, then you're just going to start playing notes and it's almost jazz at that point. It's not recipe, it's not style based. Styles, again, and I was talking to this, styles were something, those were categorizations, right? They fit bins and boxes that were popular. What you taste and what you like is your own unique thing, and that's where you need to go off and just find it.
I was talking to somebody after our designing beer recipes experience episode, and they were saying, there's a reason the BJCP, the Beer Judge Certification Program, is the one who puts these guidelines out, because these days it really is for, like you said, categorizing styles to make them easier to judge, so that you know where to place them. And that's not the sole reason. I don't think you could argue that, but another thing that a thought that I've had quite a bit over the last couple of decades as I've been brewing is that most of the, like, I guess you would call them rules that you read about online, don't use this much crystal malt or don't do this, or those are usually based on one person's anecdotal experience. I mean, if you go and you look, they're like, oh, if you used, I'll never forget when I first picked up my first 5 pounds of honey malt. I heard about this malt. I was fully expecting it not to taste actually like honey. Like, I'd done my research. I picked it up and I was on a popular brewing forum, and somebody very well known commented, you can't use more than 5%. It'll ruin your beer. And for like the first year, 2 years of me using this malt, I refused to use more than 5%. And then my brother, of all people, brews up a beer that was absolutely delicious that had like 12% honey malt. and I'm thinking, what, this should be bad, right? You got to try stuff out for yourself. And that is the beauty of homebrewing. So, Matt, thank you so much for the feedback. If you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or leave us a note on social media. One of the coolest things about having friends who live far away from me is that they occasionally send me some of their favorite commercial beers to try. Just like my buddy Matt Clay did with a Helles made by Youngblood Brewery, an experimental brewery, I believe, out of Madison, Wisconsin, that they call shower beer.
1 minute beer review with Justin and Tim.
Well, we both got a cup of sunshine here. They look good. Let's see how they smell.
I like it.
Ooh, aromatic. Holy smokes. This is good. This is a bit floral.
Very floral.
A little sweet. Not just floral, but this smells like and tastes like a British begonia.
There it is.
This is good. Definitely not dry, so I'm going to call it moist.
Got the bitter going.
This is like a cup of sunshine mixed with rain.
All right. Maybe that's what the name is.
Oh, it could be.
Rainshine.
Rainshine.
Got a little lingering bitter afterwards.
Yeah, this definitely has a hoppy finish. I'm not in love with the hoppy style beers, but
I would drink this.
This is good. This is a very drinkable beer.
I still it's IPA-ish, I think, and
yeah, I'm gonna definitely this is definitely on the high end of hops.
It's not in your face of bitter. I get it right at the end.
Yeah, this isn't one of those pretentious beers. Oh, I'm hoppy, drink me. But this is I tell you, this is a pretty darn good beer.
Yeah,
I'd give it a 7 on the Timmy J's.
It's not my style of beer, so I'm good with a 6.5.
A cup of sunshine indeed. Shower beer was so incredibly good. Bready aroma with an amazingly doughy flavor that was just irresistible to me. I was so bummed when my glass of it was gone. I think Timmy was onto something. This beer was slightly more bitter than most versions of Helles that I've had, but I didn't care. We were just talking about styles and not having to stick to the guidelines. This was an absolutely delicious example of a unique experimental Helles. I would drink it all day.
Yeah, they really described it well. They almost nailed the name, too. I was really impressed. They really almost guessed everything. I was surprised they said it was hoppy, but I think that's the difference between people saying it's bitter or it's a hop aroma. So, I mean, it's interesting. It sounded great, and I really wish I could try it. I might have to go search that one out.
Yeah, I did a little bit of research on Youngblood, and by a little bit, I mean like a minute and a half. But they do kind of sell themselves as this experimental brewery. I think they're mostly small batch. What a fun thing to have in your backyard. You know, if you live in Wisconsin or Madison, Wisconsin. I mean, I'd be going there all the time. So that's right up our alley, Andy, with the experimental stuff. So
exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Matt, for sending us so many beers. If you have a beer that you'd like Justin and Tim to review on the show, you can email me, Marshall@brewlosophy.com, and I'll get you all set up. When we return from this break, our focus will be on American wheat beer. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all-grain beer in a single, compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD, that's BRUPOD, at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. I have to imagine that when most people hear the word Hefeweizen, they immediately think of the hazy pale wheat ale with flavors of banana and clove that's popular in the Bavaria region of Germany. However, it's also a term that was picked up by some American breweries who were making wheat-centered beers with a rather different overall profile.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about wheat ale is, first we have an adjunct in the title, right? Wheat beer. What does this mean? And it's got to be hazy. And I think this kind of goes towards American brewing styles and how we've evolved over time, right? I mean, we're going to get into the history of this, and it's a very fascinating history, actually. Who is who and who, where, what was what. But American styles of beer, specifically light lager, American pre-pro pilsner, those kind of beers, light, thirst quenching, refreshing, but no yeast presence, very little hop presence.
Yeah.
And I think this is the through line towards craft beer today is American wheat ale. Even if it's a very simple beer, there is a lot of juice in this style, to be fair, and I think it's cool to talk about and just to see where we end up here. But it's definitely not your German Hefeweizen.
Well, I think you make such a good point, and I hadn't really thought of it that way. But that the American wheat beer really was the gateway for American craft brewing to explode.
Exactly.
And there is a very curious, to me, quintessential quality of American craft beer, and I can't think of a single one, a single American style at the very least, that doesn't have a clean fermentation profile. I mean, that is what defines most American styles of beer. And let's be real here. The American brewing scene in general, we are young compared to so many other regions. We were so proud of cream ale, and that was really just a hybridization of, trying to kind of mimic what was going on over in Europe, pre-prohibition. But American wheat beer is another one that was really affected by certain things in history, like both World Wars.
Yeah. So we were looking back and just to get some history, even though you think of it as a simple beer, simple style, there is a lot of history. So, wheat in production of brewing goes back to roughly the 16th century. It was interesting, right? Because you would think barley malt was the main one, but they started putting wheat in there. Yeah. But then today we put chocolate in our beer. So, who cares?
So in 100 years, people will be talking about the history of using chocolate in beer, I'm sure.
Exactly. Yeah. So, you have an interesting kind of thing in America. They didn't really want German beer. There was a little anti-German sentiment during World War I. And so there was a little bit of a back off on German styles of beer. But then World War II, we obviously sent brave young men across the world to fight World War II, and American GIs came back and they really started liking these wheat ales, German styles of beer. And so that kind of interest came back. And it's actually kind of fascinating is that, I think there is a lot of history there, because people that go expats, they'll go to Australia, New Zealand, Germany, Europe, and come back and, oh, wow, what's this cask ale? And then bring that home with them and be like, no, we need this here, right? And I think it's kind of a sidebar, but you think about we talk in that sometimes you'll see this in liquor stores, whatever. There's domestics and imports, right? That kind of distinction, which I think is ridiculous, but yeah. So they're bringing the beer, bringing those styles back home, and that's interesting. That was the kind of genesis of American wheat ale to some extent, right? You can kind of see a through line there.
Yeah, well, they're coming back and they're saying, hey, when we were overstationed fighting these wars and we were drinking these beers, and they are way different than the stuff we've got over here in America. And so they started. I think what that did was it sort of began the import thing. Bringing in beers from overseas. It surprisingly, I'm digging around trying to find when was this idea of an American wheat beer really invented. It wasn't until 1984. I mean, that blows my mind. It was not until 1984 when San Francisco's Anchor Brewing Company first released what they call Anchor Summer Wheat, which is an American wheat beer, credited as being the very first one to hit the market, as far as I'm aware. And I could not find any references to Americanized wheat beers, which again are going to be cleaner than those Bavarian versions, up until Anchor Summer Wheat. And Anchor, if you go to their website, they own that they were the first ones to hit the market with this clean wheat beer.
Yeah. It's interesting because when I think of American wheat beer, I don't think about the wheat in it, and we'll talk about that during ingredients. But I do see the marketing kind of here, right? A wheat beer, you start using the terms like pillowy and soft and easy, refreshing, and a wheat allows you to say that because wheat just seems like a nice light ingredient, right? It's interesting. So I do see a lot of marketing through this. I'm sure we were using wheat in beers way before 1984.
Of course.
Choose to talk about it this way, so that's interesting.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, and since Anchor did that, I think there's probably not a person in America at the very least who hasn't heard of Widmer Brothers Hefeweizen or Pyramid Brewing, both interestingly out of the Pacific Northwest. I do wonder. I'm biased because I live on the West Coast and I'm from Seattle area. Are there Midwest or East Coast breweries that are making American wheat beers that are well known?
Well, I mean, one of the most famous ones in the Midwest is Oberon from Bell's.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's the quintessential. It's April, summer starting in the Midwest. It's about to become 100 degrees every day. You needed a Bell's Oberon, absolutely.
Which is a phenomenal beer.
Absolutely.
I can't believe I didn't remember that one. But yeah, for us, it was always Widmer Brothers or Pyramid Brewing. And, if you drink those side by side, they are incredibly similar. I have to imagine, they're both going just for refreshing, simple, clean beers. So, well, let's break down the style a bit. And we are going to base this off of the BJCP guidelines because that really is kind of the main thing I think people look at. First and foremost, you've got appearance. And this is one of those beers that I think is really interesting because I think for the most part, you're going to find them to be rather opaquely hazy. They're going to be almost white. I mean, we call it pale straw when they're really light yellow. A part of that pale straw color comes from the fact that there is is suspended stuff, in solution, and that when it refracts light, it makes it look even paler than it is.
Exactly.
But you can absolutely get away with making a clear American wheat beer. I forget who it is, but I was reading about I think it might actually be Anchor, that they actually filter their summer wheat beer, Anchor Summer Wheat, and it's a delicious beer. So
yeah, I think what's interesting, and that's why I get back to the marketing. That's where I'm a little biased in saying, when you say American wheat beer, it's a marketing thing, because I would think, in my opinion, if I ordered an American wheat beer, I think it should have some haze, because you're talking about wheat, you're talking about that, and that's part of the experience, right? We do judge how it looks in the glass before you drink it. So, but hey, Crystal Weizen in Germany, that's a clear, meaning that's, the same thing, right? It's these clearer beers, right? In the case of German beers, it's more yeast driven and malt and grain bill driven. But, clear beer, it makes sense. And that may be what you want. You just want the lightness that wheat malt provides.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I actually prefer my American wheat beer to have a bit of haze, but I also don't mind if it's not opaque and like too much stuff in suspension. I don't want to be drinking wheat yeast. I'd rather it be, protein from the wheat and such, making it hazy. So
absolutely.
Now, in terms of aroma, what do you expect, or what do we expect based on the BJCP guidelines for an American wheat beer to smell?
Yeah, it should just be really clean. Really, the malt is the backbone here. It's not going to be very hoppy. I would say there is obviously American wheat beers edging on American pale wheat beers that have more hop to them. But for this specific style, you want it just to be clean, doughy, bready, crackery. I think it would be good if it had a little more aroma than maybe a just plain, just so that it stands apart a little bit. But it should be really clean. And maybe there's a very specific thing here about which yeast to use or which yeast not to use too.
Yes, I agree with that. There's a lot of, we're going to talk about ingredients here in a bit, but there's a lot of flexibility when it comes to making this beer. It's American after all, which means we're kind of stealing ideas from other brewing cultures to produce the styles that we call American, right? So you can use any number of types of yeast for this, which can impart, as we know, depending on how you use them, different characteristics. For me, what I expect in an American wheat beer is doughy, because that's what I kind of tend to get aromatically speaking from a high proportion of wheat. Kind of this doughy, crackery aroma with a little bit of American hop character. Definitely no banana or clove. That is not an American wheat beer. And if you want banana and clove in your wheat beer, just make a Bavarian Hefeweizen and use that yeast. But I expect a little bit of that citrus, floral, spicy, maybe just a little bit of spicy hop character. To me, one of my favorite blends is that doughy with just a little layer of hop citrus aroma on it. I love it.
Yeah, that's kind of why it's a marketing thing, of course, was the lemon or the orange, right? In the beer. But that pairs well with the light hopping and the malt profile, right? There's a reason that tastes good together. So, that's how it works. Yeah.
Yeah. And to me, the flavor kind of follows the aroma. It's about the same. There's a curious thing that some people seem to pick up in high wheat beers, beers that have a high proportion of wheat that aren't fermented with a very characterful yeast strain, and that is this kind of I don't want to spin give people the wrong idea, but it's kind of this really light lemony tartness that I've heard people describe, and I've gotten it as well. I only get it again when it's a clean wheat beer, not when there's other stuff in the way that kind of pull away from that. And this is not, I know people are going to say, well, that's because you're used to drinking it with a lemon on the rim. That's not the case. You'll hear people say that in various styles of beer that when they use a high proportion of wheat, that you can kind of get this interesting, I like it. I think it's desirable kind of lemony tartness that is quite pleasant.
I 100% agree with that. I think there is something to wheat, and especially when wheat gets in those very high percentages like would be found in this style of beer, there's a snappiness. I call it a snappiness, and that's how it interprets on my palate. So, yeah. Yeah,
I do think that the lemony tart thing might be a little bit of just expectation bias because these are served with citrus so often. But it is, snappy is a good way to put it. And that's what I tend to get in my favorite versions, like Oberon and like Widmer Brothers. That's what I tend to get. This style can finish with the low to moderate malty sweetness, according to the BJCP. To me, I'm not necessarily sure that it is real sweetness as much as it is perceived sweetness, and we can get into the philosophy of real and perceived if we want. But these beers can finish pretty low and still, in terms of gravity, and still have this kind of perceptible malt sweetness. And I think a part of that is because you're not throwing so much hops at it. They're not terribly bitter beers. So.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that to your point of that interpretation is that when these beers, and there's many styles like this in this kind of number of this BJCP style, category 1, the lightness provides two things, right? It's refreshing, but it's not distracting your palate with all these other flavors. So your to me at least, your brain kind of zooms in on all the little details, and really it brings those up, turns the volume up really high on those, and then you can see so much more. And it's interesting like that. You would think a plain, very easygoing beer would be plain and easygoing, but actually your brain kind of dials everything up and sees new stuff with inside of it. So it's kind of cool like that, actually.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think one of the areas when it comes to American wheat beer that gets a little bit more focused perhaps than other American styles is mouthfeel. There is this association that people make with wheat, as you were mentioning earlier, Andy, that high proportions of wheat will contribute a cloudy or soft mouthfeel. Interestingly, that's not necessarily what I get when I'm drinking my favorite American wheat beers. I get a really crisp, refreshing, but again, that could be a part of my expectation because I want my American wheat beer to be highly refreshing. It is a summer sipper sitting around the pool, just cooling off, not too strong. And to me, those are best served crisp and not too thick or rich. And so to me, the mouthfeel perceptibly, again, personal, the mouthfeel to me is a little bit more crisp than I think a lot of people describe it as being. But maybe I'm wrong.
Well, you're losing the yeast, right? We don't have this yeast component that's in the beer, right? That's is the parting some of the haze and then the wheat proportions. I think the other thing is I think I've had all up and down the range of mouthfeel from these, from like very light to like moderate. The other thing here, and I encourage people to play with this, especially at home with these lighter beers, is the carbonation level. The mouthfeel is really going to get dictated by the carbonation you put in here. And if you want snappy, I would go a little higher. Of course, this is a touch and go kind of thing, so play with it at home. But I think you can really tweak it out with the right carbonation too.
Absolutely. I mean, when people talk about mouthfeel or body, it's funny when they don't mention carbonation because that matters so much. Yeah,
so important.
But I think typically what you're looking for in an American wheat beer is a somewhat medium bodied beer that is just has a nice luscious mouthfeel. I perceive it differently, and again, that's going to be modulated a little bit at least by the water chemistry that you use, which we're going to talk about here in a sec. Now let's go over a typical kind of a ingredient bill that you would use to make an American wheat beer. It's not terribly complicated. In fact, this is probably one of the easiest styles of beers for a new home brewer to design because, again, it doesn't really take much.
Yeah. So I would start, if you're looking at grains, I would just start with base malt, and I think perfectly acceptable to do a plain 2-row. I don't think you need anything fancy. Now, if you want to have an edge to it, I would be looking at a more premium malt, like a Admiral or a Sugar Creek or something like that, just to add some interesting notes to it. And the other thing in the beer is wheat malt. I mean, it's in the name, right? So 30 to 50% wheat malt is where kind of the ranges I've seen. I've seen higher. The one thing you have to avoid, of course, is that wheat malt, though it says malt in the title, it does not have the enzymatic power to convert itself. So you do need a base malt or some type of extra enzyme. But it's very simple. Again, I would start at 50, honestly, just so that you're driving towards that kind of character from wheat and then see where you go. Maybe you want less and maybe you don't want it as cloudy, but I would start at 50 in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm a 50% when I make this myself. I want at least half of the grain bill to be wheat malt. I've done a little bit higher, and I think it's great with modern brewing approaches like brewing a bag or brewing a basket, however you want to define that B at the end of BIAB. It's very easy. You could do 100% if you really wanted to. Just throw a handful of pale 2-row in there for your diastatic power.
Exactly.
Just to ensure. I do believe wheat malt does self-convert on some level. It's got diastatic power, but it's not as strong as if you include a bit of barley malt. So just go ahead and do that. But 50% wheat malt, 50% 50% pale malt, or I know people who use Pilsner malt because they really want their wheat beer to be very pale. And I think that's wonderful. I have friends who have used maybe 5% C15 just to give it a little bit of an orange color. You have a lot of wiggle room there. Another thing that I think is interesting, and we're kind of going down a little bit of a rabbit hole here, is when people use different types of wheat. And by that I mean you can use your regular wheat malt, but then you could cut in maybe 25%, so half and half. If you're taking your full amount of wheat that's going into this batch, maybe you do 25% wheat malt, 25% torrefied wheat, or 25% flaked wheat, because they do, purportedly at least, contribute different characteristics. Do you want more mouthfeel? Do you want more foam retention? Stuff like that.
Yeah, and I mean unmalted wheat. There's different types of wheat. How they've processed it, and then especially where the wheat comes from. I mean, I think it'd be nice, and I think it's cool to stand out when the wheat contributes a lot of flavor. I think we're dancing around it, but this beer is pretty plain, and sometimes it kind of gets lost that there's wheat in it. And I think it'd be good to cut something else in just to add an edge to the beer rather than just have it be very plain. But that's what I like, a little bit of a character to the beer, of course. So
yeah, absolutely. In terms of hops, this is a very simple one. Use American hops. I mean, and I tend to prefer the classic C hops in this beer, but you're not using much at all. I mean, get your bitterness, and then maybe toss in I like to go fairly classic on this, so the old school bittering, flavoring, aroma addition. So I'll toss in just a small amount to get maybe around 12 IBU or so, predicted, of course, at 60 minutes, and then I'll do a nice little half ounce or 3/4 ounce of a Cascade in the middle, and then the same thing at the end, just to get a little bit of that, classic American hop character that I love so much. Yeah.
I would have thought we would have gone more of a noble, a continental noble hop, American, right? Like a Willamette or something like that. But I mean, I like both, of course. I just was wondering, because you want to pair it to some spiciness or some citrusiness. I mean, I think you go either way. I think either are acceptable in the beer. I would always have thought, if I was going to design one today, if I was told make a wheat beer, I would have used an American noble hop. But it makes perfect sense to use a C hop too.
Yeah. The American analogs to noble hops, like you said, like Willamette or Mount Hood. Those are. I actually believe one of those may be an analog to a UK Fuggle or something. But still, they still work really well. In fact, people have these ideas about, this hop contributes just this character. No, I have a friend who made my Tiny Bottom Pale Ale, but he dry hopped it with a massive amount of Fuggles. This beer was so deliciously orangey. I mean, it blew everyone's mind that amount of Fuggles just didn't taste like dirt and mushrooms. It was so it's the way that you use these hops as well. And again, American wheat beer is curious because you can kind of do whatever you want and get away with it, as long as it doesn't taste like banana or clove is the main thing. I think. So
I agree.
Now, the fun part about American wheat beer, in terms of ingredients at least, to me, is the yeast.
Yeah, so like we've said, we don't want that banana clove. We don't want phenol positive yeast. So really, in my opinion, any clean American ale yeast will work. And again, this is where you can put your signature on it. I think you can use Chico, you can use a Kolsch strain, you can use pills, you can use even lager strain, right? At a warmer temperature. I do think you want, unlike a lager, unlike a Pilsner, like a real like those styles, I think you do want the ale character in the beer just to set it apart from everything else, because that is kind of how these things kind of all sit together, is that layering of ale esters or warmer fermentation esters with the wheat, with the malt, with that light hopping. It all sits together better. I think if you did it actually at lager temperature, I think it'd come off too clean. I think you want a little bit of that just to give it some character.
Yeah, I understand that argument. I've, there's so many lager yeast out there that we've done temp comparisons with, that even in really clean, simple pale lager, people can't seem to taste a difference or perceive a difference. So I personally, the way I look at it is, unless you are forced to ferment cold at lager temps, you might as well do it warm, because your fermentation is going to finish sooner anyway. So it's more a matter of convenience. But I think traditionally you're looking at ale yeast for this type of beer, a clean fermenting ale yeast. You could, by clean fermenting, you could get away with using something like A09 Pub, which is the fuller strain as well, because any those esters, which I tend to perceive as being more perry when in a clean beer, those are going to meld really well, again, with the hops that you choose and that snappiness that you get from the wheat. So you have a wide range of yeast that you can use, yeast strains. So okay, so when brewing an American wheat beer, let's just kind of run through the brewing process, and I'm going to be upfront about this. It's not very difficult. The American brewing traditions are not difficult. I mean, we didn't do things like step mashing and all of that. It's very simple. You know, in terms of water chemistry, there are going to be people who adamantly disagree with me on this. I go for about a 2-to-1 sulfate to chloride ratio. Exactly. I do that for almost all of my beers because I love crisp, clean, slightly hop forward, even in low hop beers, which I know is confusing, but that's what I prefer. And so I go kind of a 2-to-1 sulfate to chloride ratio. I know people who will do the opposite and go 1-to-2 sulfate to chloride. So they're doubling the chloride amount because they want to encourage that kind of fluffy, cloudy mouthfeel.
Yeah, and I was going to be in that camp. Again, I don't brew a lot of these American wheat beers too often. If I were, again, designing one right now, I would have gone more soft just to play up the sweetness a little bit, play up the whole malt and lack of bitterness. But I totally see their direction, right? I think just thinking about other American wheat beers, it's not really an American wheat beer. It's an American pale ale, but it's called Gumball Head from Three Floyds. But but they say wheat beer on it, right? But it is very hoppy and snappy and stuff like that. So I think it goes both ways. I think that is very much in the personal preference column of how to design these beers.
Yeah, it's not like IPA, like American or West Coast IPA, where you really, if you want to make a classic West Coast IPA, you have to go high gypsum. You know, this is more of a what are you looking for? And I believe I was reading some recipes online when we were preparing for this episode, and a lot of people just go 1-to-1. They go even to kind of the best of both worlds. So that is also my approach to mash temperature when it comes to making this style. Is I always do 152 to 154 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, that to me is where you're going to kind of, again, and that again is about 68C, 67C. That is where you're going to, again, best of both worlds. Your alpha amylase, your beta amylase, they're both going to be kind of there. You're going to stop at a relatively, based on your OG, you're probably going to finish anywhere between 1010 and 1014, which to me is just kind of ideal for this style.
Yeah. I think the one thing I noticed when I was reading the recipes in the BJCP is, it starts at 1040 and goes up like 1055, 1056, which kind of suggests to me, you want a little bit higher in mash up, not crazy, right? In the middle to upper end, middle bottom end of the 154ish, which makes sense. You want some. I mean, we've done this multiple times that your mash temperature does not affect your mouthfeel or affect it perceivably, right? But you don't want this thing to get so dry that the alcohol starts showing its teeth, right? You want it to be easygoing. So.
Yeah, I agree. And so to me, the sweet spot is somewhere between 152, 154, 67 to 68C, kind of ideal. You'll see people who these days are saying that's just where you should mash everything because, again, it favors both alpha and beta amylase. So this is your typical 60-minute boil with your hop additions being added wherever you decide to add them. You want to quickly chill this beer. And people will say, but why? You want it to be hazy. The haze is a function of the ingredients and the style. It is not a function of poor process. I've stopped trying to drill that into people's heads. Same thing with New England IPA. If you are intentionally trying to make it murky, you're likely screwing something up somewhere else. Yeah. It should be hazy because of your ingredients and the way that those work for the style. And that's the same for American wheat beer. Wheat has a lot of protein in it. You're going to get some haze from it unless you take extra steps to really try to drop that out.
Exactly. Yeah, I think, and then for fermentation, you're going to put this in your fermentation chamber, and you're in AO temperatures, right? 60 Fahrenheit, it's around there, or 60, 65, and just let it go. And I wouldn't do anything special here. I mean, I would just let it ferment out 1 to 2 weeks, warm it up over time. Yep. And I mean, then you're going to keg it. So, this is a very, again, we've said this multiple times, it's a very simple beer, simple recipe. And so once it's done fermenting, you're just going to package it.
Yep. And I when it comes to fermentation temperature, I kind of ferment everything at 66F or 19C nowadays. So that's just what I keep I have a glycol chiller now, and I just keep it set at that. And when I turn it on, it's already set to chill my beer to 66F. In terms of, a lot of people, again, people are like, oh, why would you cold crash a wheat beer? Same thing with chilling it quickly, right? To get that cold break. Well, you cold crash it because you don't want to transfer all that yeast and muck and trube to your keg. I mean, that at least that's my view of it. Yeah. Whether you cold crash it or not, you're going to chill that beer at some point. and that is technically a cold crash. So you might as well do it ahead of time, in my book, to leave that stuff behind so that you get more drinkable beer in the bottle or the keg. So
one pro tip I've learned from the people that actually professionally serve American wheat beer: if you want the haze to actually be in the glass when you serve the keg, they store their kegs upside down. And then they flip them over at service so that the haze actually falls through the keg. So if you're one of those guys that has 20 gallons of beer and you're wondering why your third keg is not hazy anymore, well, store your keg upside down and then flip it over when you're ready to serve it.
And there are I've had beers that weren't stored that way, and it's like wheat beers, and it's really interesting because they're not bright necessarily.
No.
They have this. I think it's kind of an attractive, pale colored kind of it's haziness that you can still see through. It's like a light foggy day, is how I think of it. We talked about carbonation earlier. This to me is so quintessential in an American wheat beer. You want it to be carbonated relatively highly. I'm in the 2.5 to 2.6 range. Nice fizz when it hits your mouth, easy to swallow, easy to drink. The more higher carbonation you get, the more it's going to kind of quickly wash off of your palate. At least that's my experience. And that to me is the sign of a very good wheat beer. You want it to have that snappiness, as you say, Andy.
And another part of the carbonation is going to drive that head retention to look good on a glass, right?
That's
to really look correct, and that's where all that foam coming out and just looks delicious. So
and then final thing is go ahead and throw a wedge of lemon or orange on the edge of that glass. And I'm telling you, if people want to make fun of you because you like a little bit of citrus in your American wheat beer, let them have it, because it is good. And I was one of those who's like, no man, if you're making a good beer, you don't need to put anything else in it, until I did it. It was good,
Exactly. Yeah.
And it just contributes to that refreshing experience, which is what this is all about, is having a good time, feeling that you made something that tastes good. And if throwing a lemon wedge in there does that, then by all means, please do it. Yeah. What else do you look for in a good example of the style, Andy? Is there? I feel like we've covered most of it.
I think realistically, you want to have it be as thoughtful as the next glass of it. I think you just want to enjoy one. And I think if this is your first beer of a night or an afternoon, the first one's going to go down in 2 gulps, and then maybe you'll be more you'll be more thoughtful about the next glass. But I really think this should just be something to get you to where else you're going next, right? It should not be too deep or complex, right? And I'll agree. I'll second the idea that as I've gotten older and less snooty about putting fruit in beer. Hey, it's okay to throw whatever you want, whatever fruit in there, like maybe some lime. I'm actually playing a lot more with lime in beer these days. I'm loving it. So
we've got a couple local breweries who actually make Mexican lagers with lime flavor in it.
Exactly.
I prefer to add it myself because you can control the amount there. But I swear, I was at Crone Wolf just last night, and I ordered their Mexican lager and had 2 lime wedges in it. Why would I judge somebody for putting a little bit of lemon in their American wheat beer? Well, I love this style and have made plenty of batches of it over the years. But what happened when I tried to make an American wheat beer using short and shoddy methods? Results when we're back from this break. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. The brew-in-a-bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAB experience, you have got to go with the Brew Bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the Brew Bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew-in-a-bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a Brew Bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you, and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle, as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, The Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to Exchillerator.com today to see what The Hangover can do for you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. As a huge fan of American wheat beer, I've made my fair share over the years using standard brewing methods. It's been my experience that this style is very forgiving and quite easy to brew. I think any new brewer should give it a shot. But still, I was curious to see how one might turn out if I cut a bunch of corners and brewed one up using short and shoddy methods a little over a year ago. As usual, I brewed this one on my 240 volt SS Brewtech 1V electric system. That's full volume brew in a bag method, 5.5 gallon batch. I started my brew day at 2:28 p.m. So this was a pleasant afternoon brew day. I started by collecting the full volume of water, which was run through an RV filter, and then I just added a little amount of gypsum. People get kind of annoyed that I don't put the actual measurements, but this is short and shoddy. That's why I don't do it. Back in the days, they used to say, "Oh, just put a teaspoon of gypsum in your water." That's kind of what inspired me to go this route. I did not add any calcium chloride, and so just based off of what I know about my water chemistry, from my tap, this would probably put me in the range for calcium of right about 50 ppm. And then the sulfate to chloride ratio is probably more like 3-1 because I have really low chloride in my starting water. So, but I was aiming for this beer to be perceptibly crisp. So again, no calcium chloride. And then I really wanted to allow the wheat malt to be whatever contribution of creaminess that came through. I wanted it to be from the wheat malt. So this recipe was largely based off of past batches that I've brewed before. Again, I've made this style quite a few times because I really love it. Though I only used ingredients that I had on hand at the time, which did influence some of the stuff that I did. I used 50% Mecca grade Shaniko wheat malt. This stuff is crazy good. We've all used different forms of white wheat malt or red wheat malt. I'm not sure. That'd be a fun experiment, actually, is comparing white to red wheat malt. They're only, that color is based apparently on their growing season. It's what time of the year it's harvested. Yeah. Well, Mecca grade and a lot of these other craft maltsters out there are doing different techniques or growing different species of their malts. And this Shaniko is just, the flavor of it is hard to describe because it's like umami. It's so good.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting, one thing about wheat in general is the wheat you buy, wheat goes into bread, right? Wheat malt is kind of a secondary use case for wheat. Yeah. So we're not always getting the wheat you need. And having Mecca grade actually focus on wheat malt is going to be the whole game changer for a lot of these styles, I think.
Yeah. Well, and all those different craft maltsters, not crap maltsters. But so I went 50% Mecca grade Shaniko wheat malt with 50% La Manta pale malt. That is a very typical grain bill. I did the amounts that I ended up using were based on what I presumed my slightly lower efficiency would be doing a abbreviated mash step. So once the water was to strike temperature, I dropped the bag of grains into it and stirred to incorporate before checking to ensure that I hit my target mash temperature of, like I mentioned earlier, 154 degrees Fahrenheit or 68 C. Again, this is a beer that I want to have some residual. I know we don't perceive those sugars, but I want it to finish somewhere around 10-ish. That's kind of my aim for this style. So 154 was a sweet spot. That's what I went with. The mash was left alone for just 30 minutes, after which I pulled the grain bag and squeezed it like the Dickens until I reached my pre-boil volume. When I'm doing short and shoddy, it's really weird. Sometimes I forget to change the setting in Brewfather, and so the setting will actually be for something different. The typical batch of brew day, whatever. And so then I'll pull the grains out sometimes, and I'm like, that's a bit lower than it should be. So I just figured, I'm going to squeeze this bag a little bit harder to reach that pre-boil volume. The wort was then boiled for just 25 minutes, and for this one, this is kind of a fun one. I had some hops. I was going through my hop freezer. I'm lucky enough to have 2 refrigerators with freezers on top in my garage, and one is just dedicated to my kegerator, and the freezer on top is just for hops. And I'm digging through, and I've probably got like 15 pounds of hops in there, and I find this little bag of 2017 Cascade, which at the time, this was brewed in 2020, meant they were 3 years old, and the bag was a vacuum sealed bag that had lost its seal, but had stayed in the freezer. So based on prior experiments, we don't know, but there's some confidence that as long as they're stored in a freezer, oxidation is less likely to occur too quickly. Sure. So I was taking a little bit of a risk using these old Cascade hops. I didn't make any adjustments for degradation of alpha acids or anything like that. Again, 25-minute boil. I added 15 grams of these 3-year-old Cascade hops for a first wort hop. I then added, so they were in the boil for all 25 minutes. I then added 20 grams of Cascade at 15 minutes. And another 20 grams of Cascade at 5 minutes. This is what I was saying earlier. I really like to use classic American style hops. I know people who brew these American wheat beers with things like cluster even, because again, that is an old school American hop. But Cascade to me just offers just the right amount of a little bit of citrus punch to get in there that will meld well with the wheat and the pale malt. Yeah. So that's what I went with here. Any thoughts on that, Andy?
Yeah, no, I like the Cascade. I mean, like I said, I think you go either side of it, and I like the light edition and the timed editions here because it's giving you a little flavor, a little aroma. Just a note. I think what's cool about the short and shoddy, because we're doing this quick, right? The 25-minute. I actually believe, and this is something I picked up from making Berliner Weiss, right? Very similar grain bill. The low amount of boiling actually kind of drives that doughiness, in my opinion, right? Actually, it kind of plays to your advantage in this case. Lower, less boiling actually gives you a little bit more of a doughy character, I think. So it actually works together.
Yeah, well, and I believe it was Malcolm who did a no boil experiment that where the no boil Berliner Weiss ended up having this very doughy characteristic compared to the one that was boiled for 60 minutes. Yeah, it makes sense to me, and if that's the case, that's to me a desirable thing. So
exactly.
Maybe you want to boil a little bit less.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of these hops being 3 years old, we've done a few experiments. We know that as hops age and are oxidized, that I believe what it is beta acids kind of maintain their level while the alpha acids drop. So when you get that bitterness, it's coming more from the beta acids, which are incredibly harsh. It is one of the most unpleasant drinking experiences. The flavor even that old hops contribute, people say cheesy. I think that's how they smell. But when you taste a beer that's made with poorly stored old hops, it's that unpleasant bitterness followed by this kind of like wet, grassy grossness. It's not my thing. So I was taking a risk with these older hops, and they smelled good to me, and I would not have used them if they didn't smell good. So, so anyways, when the boil was finished, I chilled the wort. I have a Jaded Brewing Scylla immersion chiller. This is a chiller that is designed specifically for electric brew kettles that have the element installed in it. So I chilled it really quickly with my Scylla and got it down to 77 degrees Fahrenheit, 25 C. And I took a refractometer reading that showed the wort was at 1053 OG. That is just money for this style.
Perfect.
And
right on style.
Yeah, exactly. And that amounted to a brew house efficiency of 60%. People will scoff at that. That is exactly what I predict my short and shoddy batches will be. So I was okay with it. Had I mashed for the full 60 minutes, that probably would have bumped up to 65 or 68% brew house efficiency. And I'm okay with that. So again, this is a full volume brew in a bag known for being slightly less efficient than, say, a batch sparge, which is slightly less efficient than a fly sparge. So all of this stuff, maybe I used an extra pound of malt. That's fine with me.
Well, I think in general, these days, modern software, Brewfather, Brewsmith, your own spreadsheet, as long as you're predicting the right numbers, who cares what your brew house efficiency is?
Yeah, exactly. And as long as you like the beer that you're making, people who chase efficiency it's one of the things I just can't understand. But whatever, to each their own. So at this point, I did rack the wort to a sanitized 6-gallon PET carboy, and then I pitched a pouch of 4-month-old Imperial Yeast L09 Que Bueno, which again, the wort was 77 degrees Fahrenheit, 25 C. But then I also pitched, not only did I use old hops, but I used old yeast. I mean, I don't mean to pat the back of Imperial too much, but their yeast, there's something magical about it. I've used older yeast than that, and it works great. So
yeah.
I don't know what their mojo is. 4 months old. It did take a little bit longer for this for the fermentation to kick off as expected, but it went off without a hitch. It looked normal. It smelled normal. All that stuff. Now, Que Bueno yeast. This is the Grupo Modelo strain, I believe, which it goes by Mexican lager or whatever. It's used to make these Mexican style lagers. What do you think about the fact that I went with this arguably clean fermenting lager strain, but fermented at ale temperatures?
I mean, I think this is something we were finding with a lot of lager strains is they operate quite well actually at higher temperatures. I think 77 gives you a bit of an edge on the getting a yeast started and going and replicating quickly, so the beer will finish out. I mean, I think this makes sense. I mean, we've had a lot of success pitching at 65, 70 degrees with lager strains, and things come out great. It's what you had on hand, and this is short and shoddy, so we want to see what happens when you do this, and that's the whole point of this. So it makes sense to me.
Exactly, and I will say that by pitching this yeast into the 77 degrees Fahrenheit wort, I did not leave it there. I fermented it at 66 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay. So I believe, I forget if I still had my chamber with this one or if I fermented it with the glycol, but either way, I had it set at 66 degrees Fahrenheit. But I did pitch that yeast warm. Now, Que Bueno is one of the lager strains that when we did the fermentation temperature experiment, we'll do a show on this one in the future, I'm sure. It did come back significant. So people were able to reliably distinguish a cool fermented lager with Que Bueno or the Mexican lager strain versus a warm fermented version of it. So my thinking was, well, that's pretty cool. A lot of people thought that the warm fermented Mexican lager yeast one was the one that was cool fermented because it was so clean. So I was kind of hedging my bets that it was going to come out clean and not be this ester bomb. So
sure.
By the way, Que Bueno, I absolutely love that yeast. If you haven't tried it, it's a seasonal strain from Imperial Yeast that you got to get your hands on. It's fantastic. So next I placed the carboy in my fermentation chamber. So I was using a chamber. And again, I controlled it to 66 degrees Fahrenheit, 19 C. And then I hooked it up to a kind of a jury-rigged, CO2 capture device in order to purge the keg that the beer would later be racked into. At the point that I placed the yeast pitched wort or beer as it is now into the chamber, it was 4:27 p.m. for a total brew day time of, get this, 1 hour and 59 minutes.
Right under 2 hours. Good work.
Just under 2 hours. That was my hope, right? So I was pretty pleased with this. Of course, I spent 15, 20 minutes cleaning everything up, so you could say that it was a 2.5 hour brew day if you want, but still far better than the six hour brew days some people are doing in my book. Again, I mentioned it earlier, but it did take a little bit longer for fermentation to kick off in this beer. But I noticed that it was actively, there was a nice thick krausen on top of it, and it was just bubbling away 48 hours later. And it seemed to come to a halt after just 4 days. So again, the Imperial Yeast knows what they're doing, and that fermentation was super active. So 4 days in, it looked like everything was done. I took a hydrometer measurement that showed that the beer finished at 1010 FG for a total ABV of 5.4%. Tell me that's not ideal for this style,
this is on the spec. You just hit the BJCP category completely. I can already tell this is going to be a 45-point beer. It's exactly the right beer, exactly everything.
I'm offended that you don't think it's going to be 50, actually.
Well, I'm not in the 50-point club. Sorry, I can't give you 50 points yet.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever judged a beer to be 50 points.
I've seen a 48. I've not tasted a 48, but I've seen someone give a 40. I don't think I've ever seen someone give a 50. So,
Firestone Walker DBA. If somebody gave that to me at a judging table, I'd probably score it a 48 to 50. I love that beer.
Exactly.
So I let the beer sit a couple more days after taking this finishing gravity measurement just to make sure, and there was no further activity. So I racked the warm beer to that naturally purged keg. I didn't cold crash only because I wasn't in the mood to cold crash it and wait another day to get into the keg. That it had nothing to do with anything else. Most of the particulate had fallen out into the trube, which one of the nice things about using these cheap PET carboys is that you can see that, right? Mm-hmm. So then I placed the filled keg. Again, that keg was purged, but it was purged using the CO2 produced during fermentation. So I placed that keg in my keezer and I hit it with 50 PSI of CO2 for 15 to 16 hours before I reduced the gas to serving pressure, which in my keezer, the serving pressure at the time was 12 PSI. So it was just sitting sitting there for about a week or so before it was ready for evaluation. And I was hoping for, and I will do this thing when I'm carbonating a beer. I'll typically do 15 hours at 50 PSI, reduce it to serving pressure, and then test it a couple hours later just to see where that carbonation is at. If it's not where I want it to be, if I want more carbonation, I'll bump it up to 45 PSI or so and leave it for another 10 to 12 hours. So the next day, and then I'll reduce it again and test it. If I overcarb it, it's so easy to fix. People get so worried about overcarbonating a beer. All you got to do is disconnect your CO2 and then purge your keg. I found that like 5 to 10 times over the course of 24 hours will usually reduce it to a drinkable point. So
nice.
But this one was, I thought was ideal in terms of carbonation. It was exactly where I wanted it to be, and it was holding that foam. Now, seeing as this beer was brewed during the height of COVID lockdowns, I was not able to serve it to tasters like we normally do. So instead, I evaluated it myself. So take this evaluation with a grain of salt. I did it 3 times over the course of a few days, and I made sure to jot down my notes just so I could kind of compare and contrast where I was at. And we all know that like environment has an influence on the way that we perceive things. So that's why I did it over the course of 3 days, or at least I did it 3 separate times, separated by multiple hours. Now, here's what I thought of this short and shoddy American wheat beer. First off, appearance, you can go to the website and look at the picture. Pale straw color with a stark white foam that had excellent retention and left beautiful lacing on the glass. I couldn't have asked for a better looking American wheat beer, in my opinion.
Yeah, this looks exactly like what it's got. A light haze, and like you said, the little bit of haze actually drives up the color to be lighter, and looks like good head retention. I mean, this looks perfect. This is quintessential American wheat beer, in my opinion.
Thank you. I thought so too, and I just thought it looked so beautiful for the style, and it made me want to drink a ton of it, which I did. In terms of clarity, like you mentioned, it did maintain kind of this permanent haze, but it was not murky. There is a difference between muddy and murky and hazy, and this beer had that nice light haze. But if you kind of tilted the glass, you could still see through, like the tree behind the glass or whatever. You could still see through it. So that's exactly the way I like it. So I was happy with the way it looked. Now, in terms of aroma, it had a pleasant balance of doughy malt and fruity hop character that melded well with the subtle lemon-like note that I tend to perceive in beers made with a large portion of wheat. I did get that kind of lemony character in this beer. Again, it's not like lemon, like you're biting into a lemon. It's not in your face. It's just something that I tend to pick up in the background. Now, I also detected a hint of creamy vanilla, which is something that I've come to expect when I'm using Mecca Grade Estate malts. I don't know what magic they're doing to do this, but I tend to get this kind of vanilla note, very, very subtle, just a whisper of vanilla when using their malts, and I perceive nothing in the way of esters or phenols. Taken all together, smelling this beer made me think of my grandma's lemon tart slightly. She has this beautiful dough recipe that she uses for her lemon tart, and even without the lemon present in it, that citrusy thing that you get from the Cascade, just blended with this doughy malt presence, was so. It was just irresistible. So good.
I like your the note on the vanilla, because I've had so when I also drink Hefeweizen, American Hefeweizen, or American produced German Hefeweizen, right? My favorite being Live Oak out of Texas. I think there's a distinct vanilla flavor in there that I get, and I have to think it's the wheat. And I like your comment, because I think that is the using of more premium wheat malt to drive those flavors, and that's really cool.
Well, and another thing that it could be, I thought about this as well, when it comes to at least American wheat beer or even American versions of Bavarian Hefeweizen, is our brains are weird, right? So if we perceive creaminess because of higher protein content or whatever it might be, our brain might kind of start to interpret that as a vanilla thing, because it's the closest thing that we can, that we can understand, as it were.
Yeah.
So, in terms of the flavor, this beer was incredibly similar to the aroma, with that doughy, citrusy characteristics shining through the brightest, while just that whisper of vanilla lingered for a bit after swallowing. It was really, really pleasant. The fermentation character was extremely clean, which I suspect again was due to the use of imperial yeast L09K Bueno. No esters, no phenols, nothing like that. No detectable off flavors that I could pick up. Again, this beer just tasted delicious.
Nice. I mean, it makes sense. It's cool because, using those more premium malts gives you that extra character, that extra kick, even if it's subjective or, you're somewhat, biased. I mean, this sounds great. And I mean, Marshall, you just keep talking about this beer. I just want to have one right now. This is excellent.
Yeah, I still have, I forgot about the blueberry wheat beer that I have on tap, and I went out there. Well, most of the blueberry is gone now, so it's basically just an American wheat beer. So in terms of mouthfeel, despite being perceptibly creamy on the palate, this beer had what I would call a medium light body. So it wasn't completely crisp and light like a pale lager. It had a little bit of oomph to it, the combo of which made it really just enjoyable to drink. Again, no astringency. The bitterness was right on point. It was not harsh at all, which again, using those old hops, I was wondering, am I going to get that beta acid bite, which is just awful in my opinion. I got nothing of the sort. No alcohol warmth. Everything just was really well balanced.
Yeah. And I'm not surprised with the hops. I think what we found, and we've done, like we said, we've done these experiments where we compared old hops, new hops. The freezer in that's modern technology, right? Working well. And the Mylar bags, not something loose stored, I think where you're getting that beta is if you let it age out warm in a paper bag, for years, right? And so it's fine. I'm not surprised. I'm glad you did it, but I'm not surprised either.
Yeah. It's no secret. I've actually, I've used old hops a lot.
Yeah.
A lot, it's not one of those things you want to, throw out there too often because people think you're crazy. But if you take care of your hops and you store them well, you can, especially certain types of hops, you're going to be able to get away with using them 2, 3, 4 years down the line. Just take care of your ingredients. So now, not to pat myself on the back. I mean, American wheat beer is probably one of the easiest styles to make well. But I do feel like this one really did hit the mark in terms of style, representation of style. And it was a just super good example. Despite all of the weird methods I used, there were no off flavors. It possessed everything I expect from a good American wheat beer. And again, we tend to be our own worst critics, but this beer was one that I could see myself having on tap all the time. It was that good. Nice.
No, this is great. I actually kind of want to just crib these notes and make one because I don't have a Stockholm wheat recipe, and this is really good. I'm impressed, with the flavor development, and I think I said earlier, because it's so light, your brain really dives in and finds those flavors itself, like you said, the citrus, like the lemon, like the vanilla. This is great. I think one thing was, what do you think of the carbonation level when how did you go? You went and said 2.5, 2.6. Was that what you were saying?
Again, I don't have a way to measure that. We all have our charts, but I've found that if I do about 15 hours at 50 PSI, I'll usually do the 15-hour thing because that's, I go to bed and then I wake up and I come out afternoon and turn it down so I can have a pint. The 15 hours thing, if I want it less carbonated, I'll do 15 hours at say 40 PSI, whereas for a style like this, I'll do 15 hours at 50 PSI like I did. And it was right on point. I mean, this was one of those beers, thanks to the heavy use of wheat, where halfway through the pint, you'd set it down and there's still a good, 3/4 of an inch of foam on the top with that rocky texture. And it would just stick to the side of the glass. I mean, it really was. I was impressed with the fact that, abbreviated mash, abbreviated boil, there was no DMS at all. There was no diacetyl that anybody picked up. I shared this beer with, my neighbors at the very least, and they all loved it. This was one of the fastest kegs that I've ever kicked because I couldn't keep my hands off of it. It was just that good. So again, my preference for it, I'd give it like a 9 out of 10. It was that good. Probably one of the best since I've been doing this whole Short and Shoddy series. Probably, if not my favorite, one of the top 3 that I've made. And I would highly recommend, if you're looking for just a simple, refreshing beer to have around, this is, even if you don't use Short and Shoddy methods, this is such an easy beer to make and quick turnaround. But if you want a sub 2 hour brew day, I mean, give it a shot. It's really, really a great beer.
And I think another part of these recipes, when we do these lighter styles, it's a great diagnostic for your system, right? If you're just starting out brewing, or maybe you're just so jaded with all the murky IPAs you've been brewing, you just want to go back to something clean, I would just pick this up because it's going to be it's beer. We talk, this is a dumb joke, beer flavored beer, but no, this is literally beer flavored beer, and it's just going to be great. And no one is not going to like this beer, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, people who don't like beer. My wife wasn't a fan, but she doesn't like beer. One thing that we didn't hit on, are there things that you wouldn't do for this style? Process wise, I would say no. I mean, you could probably get away with a 15-minute boil if you use enough hops. What I wouldn't recommend, I mean, yeah, it's worth trying, but maybe there are certain hop varieties out there. They're usually the really pungent modern varieties, like the one that comes to mind for me is Mosaic, that has this kind of, people refer to as like diesel.
Yeah.
I just get super dank, and it's almost like a rich dankness. I don't know how else to describe it, but I'm not sure, even in small, I guess you could get away with using just tiny amounts of that, and you really start to pull that kind of berry, the blueberry notes that you can get from Mosaic, and it's probably crop year dependent as well.
Absolutely.
But I would try, maybe try using something like Hersbrucker, or if you want to use something a little bit different, but Cascade or Centennial or Amarillo. I had one made with Amarillo one time.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, it was so good. I just would probably personally kind of shy away a little bit from using some of these modern hyper pungent hops. I don't know what you think about that.
I mean, I there's that lemon one. What's the name of that lemon hop? Lemon Drop or is it Sriracha Ace? I think a Sriracha Ace would be really nice because it plays up on the lemon end. But that's an aggressive hop. I'd use a little less of it. I would say I don't also stick to one hop just so that you're getting a clean expression of one hop in the beer. And maybe as a rule of thumb, maybe stick to like 5% and less alpha acid, just so you're not getting crazy alpha acids and crazy oils from the beer. So
that's a good point too. Yeah, look at the alpha acid. I mean, you can get away with hopping with Magnum if you want, just to get that bitterness, and then going with something really pungent in small amounts later. Again, you really don't want this beer to be bitter. I mean, it's weird because when we talk about American styles in general, you tend to think about clean fermentation character and notable hop character. I mean, even American brown ale, it should be kind of hoppy,
Yes.
And the same goes for American wheat beer. You want to perceive at least some hop character, but you don't want it to be the feature, right? You want this to be a well-balanced beer. So, well, I love this beer. My friends really loved it. In fact, of the people who I know who drink beer, those who tried this were all very, very pleased with the way it came out. And again, I think if you brew it, you will be too. We got some reader comments we're going to get to on this one. The first one comes from James C. I think it's Renault. He says, I find it disheartening to see water profiles listed as Fresno water with a sprinkle of gypsum. I feel like we already touched on this. No real profile at all. Water is the most important ingredient that accounts for 95 to 98% of the beer, yet it gets basically zero attention. What purpose does sharing a recipe when 95 to 98% is a crapshoot? Well, James, this is short and shoddy. Now, I have to believe that you were a new reader to this series and didn't quite understand what the whole short and shoddy thing was. So, I totally hear what you're saying. In every other thing that I brew, I would be far more anal about reporting proper water profile. But the whole idea with this is to make it a crapshoot. I mean, we could have called this series Crapshoot because that's basically what it is. We're not doing full mashes. We're not doing full boils. We're not measuring our minerals. So.
In general, like he's right, water is important. But whenever Marshall or one of us sits down and writes one of these short and shoddies, our tongues are firmly placed in our cheeks, and we're going for it. So I would just find. I mean, I'm sure we've done American wheat ale and other recipes, and there's more detailed numbers on the water. But again, we said you want a pretty balanced water profile, and Marshall knows his water. He knows his Fresno water. He knows what to add. So that's kind of how it goes. Yeah.
It's like you said. It's if you play an instrument long enough, you don't really have to think where to put your fingers on the fretboard.
Exactly.
And it's the same. I've used my water for brewing for the last 10 plus years. So I kind of know, and I've measured out so many times. I have measured out gypsum and calcium chloride, additions. So I kind of know what it looks like. That I'm not sharing what the actual water profile is because I don't necessarily know, and I don't want to steer anybody the wrong way. But if you look at past experiment articles or other articles that I've published with using my water, you'll kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about. I could likely have used just my filtered water and gotten away with still a very tasty beer, by the way. I like that gypsum because it does kind of impart more of a crisp experience overall, mouthfeel, flavor, all that stuff. So Lawrence Prantner, who I believe is a professional brewer from California, wrote in and said, we brew an American wheat beer once a month on our regular rotation, but we use Vosk Vike and pitch at 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 32°C, and it gets packaged in 5 days. That is awesome. Really enjoyable style, very crushable. We use the same ratio of pale malt and white wheat malt, so 50-50, with a 1-to-1 sulfate to chloride ratio. There you go, 50 ppm of both sulfate and chloride from a running stream across the canyon from the brewery. That is awesome. I love it and brew it all the time, Lawrence says.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, this is like I said, these are crowd pleasers. If you like beer, I think you're not going to go wrong. And I like that's kind of a romanticism of this stream of water across from the brewery. I like that a lot.
Yeah.
Also, cool to use Kvike. I mean, it's clean ale yeast. What else do you want? And hey, if you can turn a tank around in 5 days, more power to you.
Hell yeah. Yeah, I'm down with that kind of thing. And especially if it sells, right? I mean, if you're a professional brewer, that's all that matters, I guess. Joe says, the homebrew kit that started it all for me, also known as the present that my wife regrets the most, was an American wheat beer with a very similar recipe to this one. As it was my first homebrew, it's fair to say that the methods used were a little shoddy, but the beer was awesome to my totally unbiased palate.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, this is, like we said, it's an easygoing beer, and it's your first beer, and it sometimes you say with light beers like this, there's something to hide behind, so your flaws will be magnified. But others, to me, there's a lot of beginner's luck in the first 3 batches of beer, so it's a good one to have, and you're going to get addicted as soon as you start brewing it. So
I've often wondered how many people who are currently brewing today, who started, let's say, over 5 years ago, are only brewing because of beginner's luck, and or is it really a function of the fact that they are just follow the rules really well or something?
I think my take on it is, especially when I started brewing, was that your equipment is so clean when it's new. There's a lot of beginner's luck there.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, I do feel like a lot of people really don't understand the importance of good sanitation either. So,
yeah.
I was brewing I think I've told this story before, but I was brewing with somebody one time, and they were saying, I washed everything and I sanitized it really well, and then as we're racking the wort, no joke, we're racking the wort to the carboy, he puts his finger in it to taste it. I was like, what are you doing? He's like, no, my hands I just washed my hands, they're clean. I was like, that's so gross. Anyways, yeah. So Will says, I brewed an American wheat beer last year and decided to dump a few pounds of blackberries and raspberries picked from the backyard into the fermenter once it was near FG. Quite possibly the best beer I've ever brewed. It's definitely an underrated style and a good base to experiment with fruit additions.
That's a badass move. I like that a lot, because then it's adding some color, a little bit of flavor, and just like wisps of things, right? We said this is a very blank canvas to paint upon fruit, and it's local ripe fruit. I can't think of a better addition than that.
Is there a better style to experiment with fruit additions in outside of sour styles, like sure. Berliner Weiss? But even Berliner Weiss is basically a wheat beer,
Exactly.
There is just something about wheat beer that is so amenable to fruit additions or any type of additions. I would imagine that a good American wheat beer would probably work well for people who like pumpkin, style beers or whatever. Mm-hmm. It just holds those flavors up so well. Will, only thing I'm upset about is that you didn't send me a little bit of that blackberry raspberry wheat beer to try. That sounds delicious. Final comment comes from Benjamin Cubas. A couple weeks after the article was published, actually, he posts, this crazy ass brew is fantastic. I cannot stop drinking it. I think he brewed this and then a couple weeks later came and commented on the article, with what he did. And he says, I used a citrusy, unlabeled hop instead of Cascade, and the citrus zing of the hops goes great with the overall flavor. There is still an underlying presence of the lager yeast, but to me it is a positive, not a negative. Fun beer that I would make again.
Perfect. I mean, enough said at this point. I think we've beaten this American wheat beer to dead horse. Just easy going, great beer to make, period.
Absolutely. If you're thirsty, go make yourself an American wheat beer right now. And if you want to get it done quickly, try the short and shoddy approach. I think it'll work well for you. Well, Andy, I think that about covers American wheat beer. Is there anything else before we finish up?
No, I think I said earlier, if you've been brewing a lot of other styles and you haven't revisited these lighter beers, I would do it. I think you're going to be really pleasantly surprised how complex these are for very little ingredient use. And little effort. They're so easy to brew. All right. Well, please remember to subscribe to our new podcast, The Brew Lab, so you're notified when new episodes drop. And don't forget, you can click the link in the description of this episode to read all about this short and shoddy American wheat beer. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer. Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah,